Thanks, Michael. It's always so reassuring when people say they don't know much about you. So thanks especially now to the choir. I was asked a couple of months ago if I'd lead the singing, and I said, well, I'll do that if I can get some support. So I just mentioned that to a few people that I bumped into, and in spite of what they might say, I asked them very nicely, and so thanks for all those people for turning up, especially to the violist. I get into trouble for saying violinist, but it's a viola, Monica O'Neill. Give her a hand of... And speaking of the choir, I might as well say we have an apology from Rod Larson, who's having health issues, but it's that mob is very representative of the South Burnett. Some are in the South Burnett Chorale, some with Waroolan Ladies Choir, some with Blackpot Singers, some with Kingaroy St Mary's Church Choir, the Anglican Church Choir. Some singers belong to all of those groups, some belong to none. But we're very grateful for them turning up today. So, on with the job. I think Michael summarised the general feelings behind the ANZAC Day memorial today. It's such an important day to remember all of those who have been involved in all wars. And I do make the point that more than 103,000 Australian New Zealanders have been killed one way or another as a result of their service. On with the task at hand. I did get an email from Bill and Sandra a couple of months ago giving me a prod and asking me if I'd consider doing it today. I have been fairly quiet about what happened in Vietnam, I must say. And I do feel a bit flushed out today. We'll leave the metaphor right there, I think. But the email that I got from Bill and Sandra said, your first-hand knowledge and experiences are worth sharing with our community. So that's what I'm here today doing. That's my brief, to tell what happened in Vietnam. So if you think this is a bit wide-ranging for a traditional ANZAC Day address, well, I've been asked to cough up what happened in Vietnam. I did hesitate a bit about it, and it occurred to me I better get on with it. I'd turn 80 shortly, and I thought, once you turn 80, surely death is next. So time to do it. I spent most of my time in an operating theatre in Vietnam. I'll start by saying how I got into the operating theatre, not as a patient, thank God, and then I'll give 4 snapshots of what occurred to me in Vietnam that I think sort of define the role. It troubles me that some people are holding big bunches of flowers. If you'd like to just put them down for a little while, because it's going to be a few more minutes, unless you're comfortable holding a bouquet. Reminds me, I bumped into one of my many sons the other day, and he said, I heard on the grapevine you're talking on ANZAC Day. I said, yeah. And he said, well, can I give you one word of advice? Do not drone on for 25 minutes. So I'll try and keep that in mind. So I said I'd do an outline of how I got into an operating theatre. I should say that some of the content's a bit graphic, and in view of the audience we have here, I've toned down a fair bit of it, and I'll delete a bit more having seen the audience. Can't believe you might know some people in here are over 80 years old. It's a bit of a worry. Okay, the book here. The unit I went to in Vietnam was called the 1st Australian Field Hospital, and that was dissolved at the end of the war, and we did form the 1st Australian Field Hospital Association, and I'm a part of that. And a few years ago, I think about 2016, some of the blokes decided that we better get a book going because that's all we'd have to show for our service over there. So they asked everybody to contribute. I had written a diary in Vietnam, and so I contributed a fair bit of stuff, and that's recorded in that book. And we'll come back to that book shortly at the end. I guess I could call this whole thing the luck of the draw. The luck of the draw, I got called up in the middle of 1967, went into the army, a few months at Puckapunyal in Victoria for basic training, a few months in Healesville in Victoria for corps training, and then that was the luck of the draw for medical corps. Then the luck of the draw sent to a field ambulance in Brisbane at Wacol and worked at the Yeronga Military Hospital. It's no longer there. It used to be on the banks of the river there at Yeronga. And a stint at Tropical Trials Unit at Innisfail. We went up and back on the train, a few of us, and then back to Wacol and then to Vietnam in the middle of 1968. That was to the 1st Australian Field Hospital, a few wards, a medical ward, a surgical ward, and an intensive care. We had, which would interest these primary school kids here who have been studying it, we had nursing sisters there, about half a dozen nursing sisters Australian, and a couple of nurses who were New Zealanders, and a matron in charge of those nurses. So the matron used to boss them around and then they would boss us around. There was a nursing sister in charge of each ward, and we were called medics, and there were 80 or 90 of us at any one time staffing the wards and doing what a nurse does in Australia. So I spent a short time in medical, short time in surgical, and then the rest of my ward time was in intensive care. Lots of critically ill patients, as you can imagine. In my time, nearly 11 months, about 95 soldiers were killed and came through the hospital, and about 600 injured and came through the operating theatre. While I was in intensive care, we had one fellow who came in and quickly became unconscious, and it turned out he had meningitis, and I was put on nights to special him. I specialed him for about 11 nights, from 11 o'clock at night to 7 in the morning, with 15 hourly observations and a report in the morning. And then after that, another fellow came in a few weeks later with mainly head injuries from a mine explosion, and I had to special him. So for those two, especially the commanding officer, who was Lieutenant Colonel Bill Watson, he used to call in the middle of the night. He'd come in at 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock to make sure the patient was still alive and that I was doing the right thing, I suppose. The matron would also come in at those hours, and then I'd have to write a report and submit it to them by 8 o'clock in the morning. So it was after that period that the second fellow, both those unconscious people had trackies, and so that they were connected to respirators. And so you'd try and get them off the respirator by fiddling with it to try and get them to breathe. And the second one was quite troubled because he had a bit of brain damage, and there was a lot of aggression and talking him down and restraining him. Anyway, at the end of that, I was called down and was given a promotion to Lance Corporal, and then after that I got another stripe for corporal, so I ended up as a corporal at the end of that time. I read this through this morning, and it does sound like a Skype, but it's history, and I was told to cough it up, so here we go. The third time I was called to the commanding officer's precinct, I went in and the matron was sitting in there with him, and I thought, God, this looks like a court-martial. But they said, no, we've got a plan. We've got a shortage of one operating theatre technician in the theatre, and you've been chosen to do the job. How it's going to work is that headquarters in Australia have agreed to send up the exam papers and the syllabus and all the textbooks. Sister Jan McCarthy in theatre's going to run you through and train you, and by the end of this you will leave as an occupational therapist? No, as an operating theatre technician. And he made the point that I would be the only person ever as a nasho to be trained in that way, because he said they're so dead against this even happening, and I've had an argument with them, but I want to put the best man in, and they're arguing that we spend all these resources training you, and then you're due for discharge in the middle of next year, and it's all gone. If we put a regular bloke in, we've got him for years. But anyway, he had an argument with him and he won, and he threw me in the deep end. It's interesting, I was reading up on him the other day. He died in 2014. He promoted me in 1968. In 1975, he was promoted to brigadier and then Major General, and also honorary physician to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. So I don't know what the hell that means. But anyway, his obituary said he was a man of great strength and wisdom. So in the deep end I went into the theatre. One of the main challenges with training a theatre tech in Australia was that you've got to assist and scrub for 100 major operations. And so that's difficult to do, or more difficult in Australia. It took a long time. Over there, I had done 100 major operations in about 3 months because they just kept coming. Scrubbing for a major operation is that you scrub to the elbows for 12 minutes minimum. That's with a Hibitane sort of antiseptic. And then you don robes, and so you become sterile. Not in a reproductive sense, I must say, but in a antiseptic sense. So I know one of the challenges early on was trying to understand what the surgeon was saying behind his cloth mask and trying to anticipate what instrument I've got to get into his hand. They were all pretty tetchy, those blokes. One of the other theatre techs said to me, look, the clue is do not take your eyes off his fingers. Look at his fingers, see what they're doing, and then you'll see what's coming. You know what he's going to want next? He puts out his hand and you can put the instrument in it. And I did get there eventually, but it took a lot of concentration, I guess. So I went into the theatre. One of the first things that Sister Jan McCarthy said was, you're going to do a fair bit of stitching, so you'll need practice. And she brought out this old, it looked like a citrus. He must have got it at the local market in Vung Tau. It looked like a grapefruit that had been crossed with a leather handbag or something. A rough old thing. She put slashes in it with a scalpel and then got me to stitch it up. And then she said, look, it's really important for this stitching, because some of these blokes, you're going to stitch them in prominent places, down the legs, on the arms, and they'll carry those scars for the rest of their lives. So make them neat. Get the stitches as closely together as you can, and it'll be a much better job for them, and they might even be proud to show it to people. So the priority in the operating theatre, of course, was always the casualties coming in. Underlying that, we had a lot of standard stuff. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the big pressure point was every second Monday was a medevac back to Australia. A bus would come to the hospital and transport patients to a Hercules plane at the airport, which was a few K away. And so, I should say, when the patients first came in, most of our patients were really either gunshot or mines, fragment wounds, multiple fragment wounds. And so when they came in, the fragment wounds were excised, debrided, that is, the dead flesh was taken away, but they were never stitched up. They were always just dressed, sent to the wards or ICU, and then 4 or 5 days later, they were brought back for stitching up. That was another general anaesthetic, of course. The reasoning for that was that they prevented infection that way. They were on antibiotics and the drainage was done, and then they'd stitch them up. But just before they were coming back to Australia, there was always a queue of those people, many of them having to be stitched up. It was called a DPC, a delayed primary closure in that instance. So it was their second time through the theatre. And that was when, usually in those times, one surgeon was rostered on 2 tables. He'd be starting the main stitching on one, then he'd hand over the stitching to one of us who'd finished that while he went on to the next one. I was reading in the diary there that one of those patients had 37 incisions in his, and it was both legs, from mine fragments. So it was always a hell of a pressure point, especially towards the medevac day when there were dust-offs coming in, and we had all that to deal with, and then we'd have to go midnight into the early hours of the morning to get these blokes stitched up before the thing home. I must admit, I haven't ever read right through the diary, my diary in 57 years since I wrote it, but I have in the last few weeks. Thanks, Bill, for that. And the main feeling I got from it was just exhaustion. We just worked sometimes 36 hours straight without stopping because of dust-off. The dust-off was the procedure to bring the patients in from the front, and then all this other theatre work as well. So that's how I got there. I'm just going to do now 4 quick, couple of randoms and a couple of not so random incidents that happened while I was there. The first one, I thought I'd make it a random one by reading out my diary entry for ANZAC Day 1969. So morning, plantar warts, scrotal abscess, so they're just standard things. We used to get a lot of just keeping the troops healthy, I guess, routine stuff like removal of cysts and toenails and circumcisions and appendicectomies and hemorrhoidectomies and tonsillectomies, all of that sort of happening in the background. So on this morning we had a plantar warts and an abscess, and then a dust-off. That is, the siren used to go at the hospital, and that was the signal that we had casualties coming in. So dust-off, I'm not giving any names at all because these people are all still alive. Punji stick. They used to dig holes as booby traps, put sticks down in them that had been dipped in something untoward, and then the soldier would fall in and impale himself on the punji stick. So that was a punji stick. Second dust-off, a private, MFW, that's multiple fragment wounds, abdomen, hip, legs, neck, laparotomy, colostomy, debridement. So that laparotomy is opening of the abdomen. Colostomy, of course, is the bag outside to take the contents of the large bowel while things healed up down there. Debridement was the removal of damaged tissue. The second patient in this case was a corporal, traumatic amputation right foot. That meant that it was mostly almost gone by the time we got there. Multiple fragment wounds, back and legs. Thirdly, a lieutenant transferred to 36 AVAC for a vessel graft. So they would have worked out the 2 main patients there were going to take some hours. We had an American hospital nearby, so that other fellow was whipped over there. So that's just another day at the office on ANZAC Day 1969. The second one I want to talk about is not so random. There was a bloke, I was in intensive care at the time, and we had an epidemic of malaria. And so they had stretchers in corridors and everywhere, just dozens and dozens and dozens of malaria cases. This bloke, particularly one I want to talk about, came in really crook in intensive care. But as he started to recover, his personality emerged, and he was a lovely bloke, a New Zealander. Beside his bed, he had a photo of his fiancée. They were getting married as soon as he got out. He was 20 years old. And the big news at the time was he had just been accepted into the Portsea Officer Training School in Victoria. Portsea's down there in the south near Cheviot Beach, where that former Prime Minister Harold Holt caught a submarine to China one time, you might remember. Anyway, he recovered and left. He had it all in front of him and he left. And then a few weeks later, the dust-off siren went and we were notified that it was a KIA. That's a killed in action coming in. And so the helicopter came in. We were told they didn't have a stretcher. When they couldn't really get in to extract the body, they'd drop a cable and winch the body out. In that case, we were told to take a stretcher, so 4 of us went out with a stretcher and the crumpled body was there. And they unravelled him, as it were, from the cable and passed him out. And here he is, the same bloke, Don Benjamin. I've put him on the top right here. If you have a look later, you can see his details there. Quite, I noticed in the New Zealand entry, they actually list the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the throat. So I'll just call your mind to that line in the hymn which we just sang, having talked about all his plans of wedding and officer cadet school, the line in the hymn that went, "Weep for the waste, for all that might have been." And you can say that for so many of them, of course. The third random thing I want to quickly go through was a reading from the diary. 2017, our boys were keen to take us back to Vietnam. We went in 2017, worked out where things were. There's nothing there that was there whatsoever. But I had that information from blokes in the unit, and I had printed off a Google Maps map of the area, and then I got a map of what it was like when we were there, and I overlaid one onto the other, and so we were able to work out exactly where things had been. Anyway, we went over again. In 2023, our kids thought that the grandkids were then old enough to cope with it all, so we went back. What I had done, we were there for 5 days in February 2023, and I printed out from my diary those 5 days that I had written in February 1969. And we booked a meeting room at the hotel, and I read them day by day by day what I had written in the diary. So on the day that I did that, I read that to them, was the 16th of February 2023, and here's my entry for the 16th of February 1969. So it's just another random entry in a diary. Morning, skin graft to finger, then debridement of gravel rash on a captain's elbow. That's just sort of standard stuff. Then a dust off, 1400 hours, serious, 8 wounded, 2 KIA. KIA is killed in action, 4 RA and some tanks, ambushed. 4 RA being the 4th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. So patient 1, multiple fragment wounds. I scrubbed for patient 2, who was in theatre just on 6 hours. Most shocking wounds to buttocks, and I won't go on with that here. Hatch open, he was in a tank with the hatch open. A rocket of some kind, or explosive, came through the turret, which was open just to ventilate the tank, and exploded under his seat. So you might say the luck of the draw again. Debridement for hours, that is removal of damaged flesh, laparotomy, colostomy, cystotomy. So laparotomy, opening of the abdomen, colostomy, the bag, cystotomy is an opening of the bladder. An X-ray would have revealed fragments in the bladder, so they wanted to go in and repair any damage that had occurred in there. On the other table, this is back to the diary, on the other table a craniotomy, fragment wound to top of head, very serious. Commanding officer did the remaining 5 less urgent cases in the minor theatre. We had 2 main tables in one theatre and a minor theatre. That commanding officer was also a surgeon. By this time, Bill Watson had gone. This was Lieutenant Colonel Ray Hurley. Back to the diary, finished operating 22:30, to bed at midnight, finally to sleep 0200. That always happened. We were so sort of hyped up with adrenaline, I guess, after that frenetic movement in the theatre. And I wrote in the diary, after the long scrub, the highest priority was getting to the toilet. And I recall here that Sister Jan McCarthy, who did the training of me over there, she always used to say, before you start scrubbing, go to the toilet, because you never know how long you're going to be standing there. So I mentioned in that dust-off there were 2 KIAs, and just to give them a name today, I looked them up, and these are the 2 at the bottom here. A Private Raymond Maguire from Burwood in New South Wales, 22 years, and a Private Victor Peterson, a Nasho from Southport, 23 years. So that was the 3rd snapshot. The last snapshot I want to do is one regarding a sapper, Peter Bramble. So straight from the diary, dust off, Peter Bramble, multiple fragment wounds, both thighs, back, left wrist, buttocks, resuscitated for 3 hours in triage. Operation, suture of popliteal artery, partial debridement left leg, ligation left popliteal artery, popliteal is behind the knee. Cardiac arrest, 14-29 hours. That was written up on a board to record the whole thing always. Open cardiac massage, pronounced dead 15-12 hours. So that was 43 minutes. They did internal cardiac massage on him. He had been resuscitated in triage before that. A total of 41 units of blood transfused. So that was the rather clinical account in the diary of what actually happened that day. I think the 41 units of blood is astonishing. Of course, when he was in triage, they were pumping it in with 3 or 4 IV lines, and it was running out while they tried to stem the flow. And I remember lots of buckets and mops and desperately trying to clear it up so that people weren't slipping on the floor as they were attending to it. So that was probably one of the saddest days. He was there on the table. Someone brought a sheet and it was draped over, and everyone just stood transfixed and silent for, it was a long time. I suppose it was a couple of minutes. It was sort of like a spontaneous act of respect and a palpable feeling in the room of despair, I suppose. It still catches me in the throat. It occurred to me there, as we stood, the luck of the draw and the unfairness that there would have been 10 or 12 people in that operating theatre that day, 2 national servicemen, Peter Bramble and Peter Curtin. Him blown up and dead under the sheet, and me doing very well, thank you. And that has stuck with me. I suppose it's, the why me thing that occurs to people, and the luck of the draw. So there we go. We have named 4 not national servicemen. I don't know that they all were. This was a New Zealander, so he wasn't a national. The other 3 were nationals, but I'm just making the point. We've named 4 people who were killed in Vietnam. Just remember, there were 520 odd altogether killed there, but it's good to be able to put a face to a name. I was going to say I did just check on Peter Bramble when I was looking up his details to make sure that it was in the public domain and I could talk about it today. And it had on one of the tributes a button that said next of kin, and I hit that and it said Iris Bramble, and I googled that, and that was his mother. She only died in 2023 at the age of 98, and we were told at the time that he was the heir to the Brambles transport empire. You don't see them up here much, but Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Brambles is written over a hell of a lot of trucks that carry stuff around. and he was the eldest son who was to take over that. So we think of Iris Bramble in her 98 years and her family. There were a few other kids and a couple of other boys, I noticed when I looked that up. And so from that hymn that we sang earlier, I'll just say, weep for the homes that ache with human pain. And about Peter Bramble and what might have been for him. Weep for the waste of all that might have been. And we apply that to those 103,000 other soldiers who'd been killed in all the other wars. Right, I just want to finish by reading something from an address. That's not it, that's a resolution. It was an address given at the Australian War Memorial last year in Canberra by Major Angela Uphill. She was a physiotherapist in the Australian Medical Corps for 22 years. She lost her husband as a result of his involvement. They were both involved in Afghanistan. So I'll just read this paragraph from her. On ANZAC Day, this was her address last year. We remember all those who have died, whether through combat, training accidents, illness or suicide, and acknowledge the families, friends, colleagues and communities who are left behind. Every loss is a tragedy and leaves us with a lifetime of memories we never got to make, of missed milestones and lost opportunities. This was not the life we had planned, but we who are left behind must learn to carry our grief and continue to honour the memories, stories and service of those who we have lost. I think it's an appropriate point here just to acknowledge the service of Alex Berry, who died a week ago in Kingaroy, a well-known Kingaroy identity. He actually served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. He did a year before I went in an artillery battery, I think 4th Field Regiment, and then he did another stint in this very same unit as I was in. After I had gone, he went back in 71 and did a year actually in the operating theatre in this unit. So we remember him today. Talking about that book, I have, I guess it goes back to Bill and Sandra's exhortation to share your story with the community. I have, a couple of years ago, I mentioned to Bernie that when the book came out, I'd give him a copy for the Historical Society. So if Bernie would like to come out now, I'll thrust one of these at him and he can take it there. We'll leave a couple here for anyone who wants to look at those today. Bernie, I think, will have that one on display at the Historical Society. Oh, it's really good upper body work, I can tell you. There you go. So, do you want to say something? Yeah, just one thing. I had forgotten about this. I was flicking through it this morning and I submitted quite a bit from my diary, and I noticed on chapter 4 they've made it a subtitle of the whole thing, an extract from my diary that says, he had shocking wounds to his legs and chest. As he was wheeled into theatre, he heard Sister McCarthy speaking and yelled out, "That's an Aussie Sheila. Bring her in here before you put me under." So she went in and had a few words with him before they started. So I thought that was a nice Aussie touch to happen. I'll hand back to you, Michael. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think Bernie put that together. That was my Uncle Jack, my mother's brother, Jack Ross. She also had another brother, Harry. And when I was growing up, we had 2 Uncle Harrys, Uncle Fat Harry and Uncle Skinny Harry. And Uncle Fat Harry was my mother's brother, and he had been through World War I, and he used to talk about nothing else but World War I. He had shrapnel in his buttocks, and I was number 10 of 11 kids. We lived at Maryborough in Victoria, and he would come up from Melbourne occasionally and let us have it about the war and his buttocks and the shrapnel. And after he went, we loved talking about it because we thought buttocks was a swear word, I think. But then I had another Uncle Harry, who was my father's brother-in-law, who'd been in World War I and never mentioned anything about it. And so I think, looking at my life, I probably subconsciously decided to follow Uncle Skinny Harry and shut up about it, rather than have people say, "Oh Jesus, here he comes again with all his war stories." It occurs to me now that Bernie will take this book and devour it, and forevermore people are going to be saying, "Oh Jesus, here comes Bernie with all his war stories."